Hello, this is Falterfire, and today's video is a breakdown of a lot of the cards that changed in 5100. I originally intended to have this video come out a while ago, but then I got distracted by Monster Hunter World and I didn't end up, or Monster Hunter Rise, didn't end up recording it until now. So I'm not going through all of the cards that changed here, just some of the ones I think are the most notable. I should have timestamps for different types of cards if you want to see that. At the very end, I do show the list of all the cards I didn't talk about. And the last thing I want to mention up front is that if you want to see the original versions of cards, I will have a link to the patch notes, which will tell you exactly what changed on each card. And that link to the patch notes will be in the description. So I don't have card images for the old versions of cards, just the version 5100 version of cards. So with all that said, let's get going. Let's start with the bad news, the cards that got nerfed. Not all of the cards here got strictly outright nerfed. Some of them got more changed. Most cards that received some amount of nerfing got some amount of compensation in another way, but I'll talk about that as we go through. So first off, evasion cards. If you played the last version, you may be aware evasion was incredibly powerful. With Merly in particular, with, for example, Mana Dance, you were able to pretty easily end up stacking a lot of evasion. And since it wasn't temporary evasion, in especially boss fights like Emerald Dragon, Ruby Dragon, Baelator, it was possible to be functionally invincible. You just were not ever getting hit, and the monsters weren't doing anything to you besides raw damage, so you were safe. This patch, almost all of the cards that generate evasion now just give you evasion this turn. That means they're still very, very powerful, but you have to play them on the right turn. So if you play Mana Dance and the enemies aren't attacking, the evasion is functionally wasted. You will still get your 2 mana, of course, or whatever the other effect is on the card, but the evasion will be wasted. It is worth noting there are still some cards that give non-temporary evasion. I'll talk about those next. And if you have regular evasion and temporary evasion, then the temporary evasion is used up first. So that works out the way you would want it to. So most of these cards got changed slightly to account for that. For example, Feint used to be 4 shield and gain evasion 1, and now it is gain 6 shield and evasion 1 this turn, if the last card you played was a strike. Mana Dance is the only one that was just outright nerfed, because it is still gain 2 mana, and then gain evasion 1 this turn, and Mana Dance Plus is gain evasion 2 this turn. And otherwise, it didn't get any buffs to compensate, but it is still very, very powerful, so that's fine. Swift Strike used to be 3x2, now it is 4x2, so that's the buff it got. It also, unfortunately, Swift Strike Plus is no longer 4 hits. I think it goes to like 6x2 and evasion 2 this turn or something, which is a little unfortunate. It was an interesting pickup just because you would sometimes upgrade it so you would have a 4x hit that also had other value. But it's still not bad. Sharpened Senses is pretty close to being a new card. Previously it was you get evasion 1 and you get wits 1. Now you just get evasion 3 this turn. What this means is that Sharpened Senses on the right turn will often let you evade all of the attacks in elite and boss fights. There are a lot of normal fights where it won't do that. For example, like Silgas, there's a turn where if you're fighting multiple Silgas, they'll all do a triple attack, or like if you're fighting a Natha and a Silga, stuff like that. But it still will generally be a lot of value in terms of evasion, and it will be often much better than any 2-mana shield card could be, with the downside that it won't do anything against debuffs, and it won't let you save it between turns. But Sharpened Senses is now a very powerful defensive option that you should consider for any deck that you are running that can actually take advantage of evasion. Like Merly obviously gets a lot of value out of it. Paladin much less so, because Paladin wants to be actually blocking attacks. And like Rauden would get less value out of it because Rauden is often freezing. And so Sharpened Senses doesn't do anything if you are freezing the enemies. So that's something to keep in mind. But it's not a bad card overall. It is now, I would say that Sharpened Senses is actually one of the cards that is now better on this patch than it was last patch. Because although evasion 1 and wits 1 is fine, because non-temporary evasion is pretty good, it was ultimately only really good if you were specifically going for that evasion stacking strategy, whereas now it is useful in more decks than that. Adaptive Defense just got 2 more shields, same as Feint. Feint and Adaptive Defense just went from, I think, 4 shield to 6 shield, otherwise unchanged, besides the going to evasion this turn instead of just gaining evasion. Phase Grace now applies 3 arcane to yourself instead of 4. This is a bigger deal than it seems. It means that you will have a much easier time. You'll usually get in 1 to 2 extra Phase Graces before you'll detonate yourself. And the nice thing is, you will know before you play the Phase Grace whether you're going to actually want to do it, which means that you can help sort of mitigate arcane detonating yourself, because you can just not play the Phase Grace if you don't need the evasion this turn. So evasion cards that didn't change. I did want to specifically call out the 2 evasion cards that still give you non-temporary evasion. They are Blade Dance, which is a Merle card, and the important thing here is Blade Dance Plus is still evasion 2. So you still can play evasion stacking Merle, you're just dependent on getting Blade Dance. Hunting Trance will give you evasion 3, 4 if it's upgraded, but then it decreases by 1 each time you play it. So once you've played it a few times, you'll only be getting evasion 1 out of it. But that is still pretty good. So both of these, keep an eye out for them, especially if you're on Merle. Obviously, Blade Dance, you have to be on Merle, but Hunting Trance, it's worth keeping an eye out for. It drops from the Silga Alpha Elite in Area 2, and that will give you a way to gain evasion that is not temporary, which can be useful, especially if you're fighting like Emerald Dragon or Ruby Dragon that don't attack on necessarily every turn, but that you really want to evade on the turns where they are attacking. So, the other big nerf is Purity. Here are the Purity cards that still give Purity. Blessed Strike went from 2 mana, deal 3x2 to the first enemy and gain Purity 1, to 4 mana, deal 5x2 to the first enemy and gain Purity 1. Usually, something like this, where you get more expensive but you have more effect, would be good for a card. But for Purity, where you usually want your Purity sources to be cheap, like there are a lot of decks that were playing Blessed Strike not because they cared at all about the damage, but entirely because it was cheap Purity, now that's much less true. The upgrade is like 3 mana, do 5x3, gain Purity 1, which, isn't bad damage, but it does mean that you're still only getting Purity 1, which hurts. I am not running Blessed Strike anywhere near as much as I was before, because I think at 4 mana it is a lot harder to slide into a lot of decks. And with the changes with Cleanse now being more effective, I generally speaking will run Cleanse instead of Purity. Barrier of Frost likewise went from like 2 mana, gain 5 shield and gain Purity 1 if an enemy is frozen, to 4 mana, gain 12, gain Purity 1 if an enemy is frozen. I wasn't ever playing Barrier of Frost much to begin with. This is a routing card. I wasn't playing it much to begin with, so it doesn't affect me that much, but it is worth noting because I know some people were playing it. And bumping to it is also notable as like the only common source of Purity aside from Inna being able to generate mechanized plating with her tools. So yeah, Barrier of Frost, it's fine, but I don't tend to. It is still like 12 shield is actually a decent amount, so it's not the worst for that reason. I would run it over block, for example, but I don't play block, so that's not saying much. Gleaming Aegis is the last one. It used to gain Purity 2, it now only gives Purity 1. Gleaming Aegis, unlike the others, is still incredibly good. I still will take it. I still will run it even if I don't have spells to go with it, because even more so now that getting Purity 1 for 2 mana is much, much harder to come across, I will absolutely take Gleaming Aegis. It's a monster card from the Arcane Elemental Elite, by the way. Blessed Strike is generic. Rowden, Elite from Arcane Elemental in Area 2. So yeah, Gleaming Aegis is still very good. It still upgrades to be Purity 2, so that's still worth considering. I believe Barrier Frost also still upgrades into Purity 2, but I don't love Gleaming Aegis. I still love Gleaming Aegis. I don't love the other two anywhere near as much. All right, and then there are a couple cards that used to give Purity that don't anymore. Calculated Deception, which used to give you Purity 1 and Wits 1 when it transforms a card into a Deceiving Blast. Now it gives you Mana Boost 1 and Wits 1. It's still a pretty reasonable card. It's still very funny. It's just losing the Purity makes it harder for me to justify running it in a lot of decks. Although I think it still will do most of what it was doing before. Warcry is interesting because instead of giving yourself and all allies Mighty 2 critical to Purity 1, which it now gives yourself and allies Mighty 2, Critical 2, and then it gives Weak 2 to all enemies. This means that although it no longer does the same amazing thing it did before, it is still amazing. Mighty 2 and Critical 2 are still both very valuable, and Weak 2 to all enemies is also insanely valuable. This also has the advantage of meaning that you can use Warcry to replace your Hobble eventually, or just to supplement your Hobble to ensure you have 100% uptime on Weak. Warcry is very, very good now. I mean, it was very, very good before. It is still very, very, very good. It just won't do Purity for you anymore. It is notable, though, that because this no longer gives Purity to all allies, we no longer have this as a good tool for keeping allies alive in fights where enemies are going to drop debuffs on your allies. There is a new card, Aid, that can kind of help, but it's more expensive and only targets one ally instead of Warcry, which hits all of them. So, that said, Warcry is still good. You'll still run it. Calculated Deception is still fine. You'll still run that one probably if you were running it before. But neither of them gives Purity anymore, and that is notable. The next thing that got nerfed. Almost all of the Curse monster cards now give a little bit less Curse. Bane used to be Curse 4, now it's Curse 3. Dead of Night used to be Curse 2, now it's Curse 1. Although, Dead of Night went from 3 mana to 2 mana, which is, like I said, not all of these are straight nerfs. Dead of Night being at 2 mana is actually pretty nifty. If you weren't caring that much about the curse damage anyway, and you cared about this more as a weak and hidden source, this is very good. Morbid End went from Curse 12 to Curse 10. That's still fine. That's still, like, if you were taking Morbid End before, I think you're still taking Morbid End now, even though it is weaker. Likewise, Shadow Breath went from Curse 4 to Curse 3 to all enemies, and then the upgrade is, if pretty much all of these, if they got -1, the upgrade is also -1, and then Morbid End Plus is like now 13 instead of 15, because Morbid End got -2, so Morbid End Plus got -2. Dark Focus, likewise, used to be give Curse 2 to the first enemy, is now Curse 1 to the first enemy, but it's also still a mana card that turns back and forth between being a lot of mana and a lot of card draw, so you're still running Dark Focus. Of these, I think Bane is the one that probably gets hit the most, both because on the face of it, it is now less impactful, and also because Bane is the one that is most reliant on your other cards giving Curse, so the fact that Curse in general got nerfed means that Bane in particular got multi-nerfed, because it is indirectly nerfed by every other Curse generating card getting nerfed. But overall, I think all these cards are still good. All of them are still worth considering picking up. Shadow Breath in particular is still great as an AoE way to just, if you're a slower deck, the fact that this is weak and a bunch of Curse in a single card is very good. Yeah, all these are still good cards. Morbid End is still the most niche of these cards, but I've still used and been happy with all of them after the nerf. Bane is the one, though, that I think is still sitting on the edge the most. So then some monster mana cards got nerfed. Lightning Communion got deleted from the game. It used to be gain 2 mana, you gain 3 more mana, and powerful 2, period, if an enemy was shocked. Now you get 2 mana, and then you get 2 more mana and powerful 3 this turn. And powerful 3 this turn if an enemy is shocked. So Lightning Communion now gives temporary powerful. So it's already a condition that is, while not very difficult to meet, is a little bit challenging to meet. Like, having an enemy be shocked, even if you're a deck that outputs a decent amount of shock, that's not guaranteed, since you tend to use up shock pretty quickly in most decks that apply it. And powerful 3 this turn is an okay buff, but it's like, we have the card Hunter's Focus, which is an area 3 common monster card that gives you 3 mana and powerful 2 this turn. End of story, that's it. So here you're getting 1 more mana and 1 more powerful this turn, but you're having to meet this condition and give up an epic card pick to do it. And that's a pretty big ask, especially because if you have a reroll, you're also giving up the chance of taking Dragon Form instead, because Dragon Form is the other monster card here, and Dragon Form is still incredibly good. Lightning Communion is just very bad now. I think it is worse than most of the generic epic mana cards you could have. I tend to think that I would rather have Mana Eruption or Spry Vigor for more reliable if I wanted more mana. And then I don't think the upside of this, even when you meet the conditions, is good enough that I would be really excited about taking it over whatever cards I had in my card pool that I specifically wanted for my deck. I think that even if, because the other thing is, if you are a deck that is applying, that can rely on an opponent having shock, it's likely that you don't get much out of Powerful 3 because you're doing single big hits. And so, for example, Singularity doesn't get any benefit from, or it doesn't get much benefit from Powerful 3, because if you're already doing, 50 damage from your Singularity or 60 from Singularity Plus, then bumping that to 53 or 63 is largely irrelevant. And because the shock doesn't even increase that powerful, so it's like you're hitting a shock with your Singularity, you go from 100 before you had the Powerful to 103 with the Powerful 3. Who cares? So I think Lightning Communion is just overall a disappointing card. The decks that want the Powerful 3 this turn aren't likely to be able to consistently get shocked out, and the decks that are effectively going to be able to get shocked out are unlikely to care much about the Powerful 3. And there are better ways to get 4 mana from your mana card. Corrupted Font, on the other hand, it went from gain 8 mana, gain Curse 1, to gain 6 mana, gain Curse 1. This is still incredibly powerful. You'll still take Corrupted Font all the times that you were before, I think. It does make it slightly worse in some decks than Mana Eruption. If you're playing a growth-heavy deck, Mana Eruption is now better than Corrupted Font in a decent number of scenarios. But outside of that, Corrupted Font is still the gold standard for just getting a lot of mana right now. And with the Cleanse meta change, with everybody being on Cleanse now, that makes the Curse even more negligible than it was before. And even against, like, Maw, I am happy to have Corrupted Font, I think. So yeah, I would still take Corrupted Font pretty much anytime it's offered, unless I just really didn't need mana and the other epic cards were very good, or if I was playing to reroll it and get Ruinous Gamble. So other nerfs. This is just a grab bag of various other cards that ended up getting nerfed in some way or another. First of all, doubling Spyglass. It can no longer copy other trinkets. You can blame Duplicitome for this. There was an infinite combo you could do with doubling Spyglass and Duplicitome, where you would copy an Inkwell and Quill and anything else, and then you would get the Duplicitome copy from the Spyglass, and you would use one of the Inkwells to copy the Duplicitome you had in hand. You'd use that Duplicitome to copy the Duplicitome and the other Inkwell, and then you could just do that, and then you could get infinite copies of any cards in your hand. And you weren't drawing cards, so you weren't being hit by fatigue. And it was just very effective and very unfair and a bit too easy to pull off. There are other trinkets that doubling Spyglass was too powerful with, but Duplicitome is the one that really bought this nerf. Regrowth can now only draw non-mana. This did technically sneak in the last hotfix before this patch. It was in like 4636, but not 4635. But it's new enough that I'm listing it. So Regrowth can still be quite powerful, but the fact that it can no longer get back mana is very significant, because it means that Regrowth is now going to have a lot more turns where you can't quite afford to fit it in. You need a lot of mana to make this work. So keep that in mind when you're considering Regrowth. Vindictive Strike. Vindictive Strike, you gain Vulnerable 1 if you have Vengeance, and you deal 3x3 damage to the first enemy and 2 additional damage per rank of Vengeance. The change here is that you would get Powerful 2 this turn for each rank of Vengeance, and you would deal damage to the first enemy. This card is still very, very good. It can still do a lot of damage, especially because that additional damage per rank of Vengeance will be a flat number that can then be increased by Vengeance. So if you had, say, 10 Vengeance, then you have plus 80% damage. So you would do 20 damage base, plus 80% from the Vengeance, which would be another 16. So this would then do a 36 extra damage, which is pretty good. So Vindictive Strike is still a very good card. It can still do a lot of damage in Catan decks. It just is less of an instant win than it was before. So keep that in mind. Still good, just not quite God tier anymore. It's just slightly below that. It's demi-God tier, let's say. Strenuous Vigor is now heal 6, and you empower 2 yourself, and you create and discard 2 exhaustions. The upgrade now goes to heal 12, and you only create 1, or I think it goes up to heal 10, and you only create 1 exhaustion. So the big change here is Strenuous Vigor you do now actually want to upgrade, because the 2 exhaustions is a much bigger cost. Strenuous Vigor was too strong as a easily repeatable and low cost, because you didn't have to spend an upgrade on it, way to just quickly take a run out of control. So it is now a little bit more investment. It is still incredibly powerful. You will still run Strenuous Vigor when you get the option, and it will still win you a lot of runs. It's just not. It is just less free to take than it was. Pact of Blood. Pact of Blood used to lose a lot more health, but it wasn't removed. Now it is lose 4 health, gain Frenzy 1, removed. That means that Pact of Blood can only be used once per fight. It's actually stronger in a lot of decks than it was before. You are more than happy to have an extra turn once per fight, especially for the low cost of 4 health. But you can no longer go infinite with it like you could before. So that's worth noting. So I would actually say that this card gets better in Dwarfist decks that were planning to use it fairly, and just worse in decks that were planning to abuse it. Arcane Crystal. Your cards cost 2 less to play this turn. You gain Arcane Leak 1 and Arcane Rune 1. So you may be wondering what changed here. And the answer is nothing in the text. The change here is that Arcane Crystal is now a skill instead of a mana card. This means it is affected by fatigue, which means that going deep on looping Arcane Crystals is now a little bit harder. The card is still incredibly powerful. It didn't otherwise get nerfed. The Arcane Leak is a bit harder to manage now because Purity is a bit harder to come by, but Silan still does have defensive mod to generate Purity, and can still use like Strenuous Vigor to up the amount of Purity he has, and is still fine taking Peace of Mind to get Purity. So it's not the end of the world, and you will still get a lot of value out of it. I just think it's worth noting that the Arcane Leak is more likely to be relevant, especially if you upgrade the Arcane Crystal and get Arcane Leak 2 if you're relying on Cleanse. But yeah, Arcane Crystal now slightly worse because it's affected by fatigue, but otherwise still fantastic. Wall of Thorns. So this isn't entirely a nerf. It went from it used to be gain 12 shield and reflect 4. Now it is you gain 14 shield, reflect 3 this turn, and reflect 2. The reason I say this is a downside is that it means since so much of the reflect is temporary, you can no longer play Wall of Thorns repeatedly to easily end up stacking reflect over the course of a fight. This particularly affects Paladin, who didn't exist before this patch, obviously, but would have loved old Wall of Thorns because reflect stacking is a Paladin thing. But unfortunately, you can't do that because Wall of Thorns got nerfed slightly. So it is slightly stronger on the turn you play it, at the cost of losing a lot of the long-term value in terms of reflect damage, and making it much, much worse if you're trying to loop it with like regrowth or just drawing through your deck quickly and playing it, because now if you're playing it every 2 turns, you're only breaking even. Because if you play it this turn, next turn you'll untap with reflect 1, turn after that you'll have reflect 0. Whereas before, if you played it this turn, next turn you have reflect 3, the turn after that you would have reflect 2, and so if you played it again, you would be at reflect 6, and then so if you're playing it every 2 turns, you're getting +2 reflect each time. And now that's not true. Even if you're playing it every turn, you're still only going up by reflect 1 every turn, which is not very good. So yeah, much harder to stack reflect with that one. You'll still take it in most of the cases you would before, which is that like you need a shield card, and here's a shield card. You're just going to be less happy with it. All right. So that's all the nerfs that I wanted to talk about. Let's talk about these shiny new toys. So this was originally going to be called cards that got buffed, but not all of these are straight buffs. Some of them are just side grades in ways, and others are just they do something different than they did before. So let's go. First of all, Predator. So Predator is a buff that existed but was very hard to come by. It was only on 1 monster card in Area 3. So it is you do 10% extra damage to an enemy for every debuff on that enemy. So if an enemy has, for every unique debuff. So if an enemy has, let's say, Poison 5, and that's the only debuff, you will do plus 10% damage because they have 1 debuff, and that debuff is Poison. So you get 10% per debuff, 1 debuff, 10% damage. If they have Poison 5 and Weak 5, now they have 2 debuffs, or it could be Poison 1 and Weak 1. The number doesn't matter. They have 2 different debuffs. So they have Poison and Weak. Now you're doing 20% extra damage. So there are now several cards that give this buff that are generic cards, or we have 2 that are monster cards, but The generic ones, you have Barbed Gale, which is a common. It is 4 mana, you gain Predator 2, you deal 8 damage to any enemy, and you give all enemies bleed 6. This is okay if you ignore the Predator. You're dealing 8 damage and then 6 bleed to all enemies. That is 14 damage to the enemy you target for 4 mana, which isn't bad, even if 6 of the damage is delayed. And the bleed on the other enemies is kind of gravy. But the Predator 2 is why you're running this card. You put this card in your deck because you want to try and build around Predator, so you will be running a bunch of ways to apply debuffs. And the Predator deck is fun. I have a couple runs with Predator decks that I've recorded and uploaded, I believe. That Predator is fun because you have the challenge of figuring out which debuffs you can stack together to get value while still having damaging cards to take advantage of the Predator. Hunt is now gain critical 2 and Predator 2 if the enemy has lost health this turn. It used to be just critical 3. Hexing Strike is now gain Predator 2. You deal 3x2 damage to the first enemy, and you corrupt it twice if it is vulnerable. And so that is pretty nice. So Hexing Strike, the Predator deck existing already makes Hexing Strike more interesting. And in particular, the fact that it now itself picks up Predator also helps, because Barbed Gale isn't amazing, so you'll often want to cut it later. So being able to transition from Barbed Gale into Hunt and Hexing Strike as your Predator sources is pretty cool. There is also one new Predator card, Tyrannical Focus, that I talked about in my new cards video that I considered including here, but then I didn't. So the monster cards. Persecute is amazing. So Persecute was a curse card. I didn't include it in the nerfs though, because the change here is instead of getting curse 2, you get Predator. Instead of giving curse 2, you only give curse 1, but you get Predator 2. So this applies curse 1, frail 2, vulnerable 2, weak 2 to any enemy, and then it gives you Predator, which means that enemy who now has 4 debuffs on them, you get 40% extra damage against. And one of those debuffs is vulnerable, so if they weren't vulnerable before, you now have 70% extra damage, 40% from Predator, and 30% from vulnerable. So Persecute is really, really good at making an enemy be very, very much in danger. Defiant Howl is 2 mana. Give yourself and all allies powerful 1 this turn, and Predator 1 per enemy alive. You heal 6 yourself and all allies. This card used to be heal 8, so it just lost a little bit of healing, but you now get it now is a Predator source, which is pretty cool. It is a way to heal all of your allies, which is pretty rare. It is a way to give Predator to your allies, and it's the only thing that does that. So overall, it's a pretty fun card. But mostly not a card that is the highest value, just a card that you'll sometimes take because you kind of care. I apparently duplicated that slide. Anyway, on kill cards. I meant to add in screenshots of what the transformed cards do. Unfortunately, I don't have those. Whoops. So the on-kill cards, all of them now, this happened to Essence Harvest in the last patch, but in this patch, all of the cards that do something when they kill an enemy, except for Intimidating Strike, which is still a bad card that nobody plays, you get that they transform into a different card after you get your first kill, because with the ability to summon enemies, it was too easy to abuse, for example, Lust for Blood, because you would play Lust for Blood, you would play things like Accursed Ceremony or Mystic Shadow Blast, you would kill the Vengeful Shade you summoned, and you could go infinite, because as long as you could keep summoning more shades and then killing them with Lust for Blood, you could just keep taking extra turns. You can't do that anymore. Devouring Strike also went from 2x3 to 4x3, and it went from 2 to 3 mana. So the thing is now, Devouring Strike you can actually kill things with without having to spend a ton of effort to line it up, and that makes it way more playable. And it transfers into Sated Strike, which I believe gets powerful when it kills things. And Bloodcray Strike I think just hits a bunch and can only be played if an enemy has lost health this turn. And then Absorb Soul turns into Essence Blast, and it, I think, heals and increases recoverable health by more than it did before. So all of these cards are mostly going to do the same thing. It's just notable that they now turn into different cards instead of just being the same thing. Silan's tools. So because Silan's passive changed, Silan's level 4 passive used to be that you would shuffle a Flash Bomb and a Healing Potion into your deck at the start of combat, and that would just happen every combat, and there were cards in your deck, and they were removed on play. Now you create one into your hand at random whenever your deck is shuffled, including on turn 1. So they deal 5 damage all in. So Flash Bomb, I think, does 1 less damage, and it only gives weak 1, but is now 0 mana to play. And Healing Potion now only heals 4 in addition to gaining 2 mana. But again, it was already free, but it's still free. But now neither of them take up card draws, which is pretty nice, especially for Healing Potion. Healing Potion could sometimes be really awkward because you would draw it while you had Fatigue, and so because it's not a mana card, it's a tool, it would cost you mana to play the Healing Potion, and you would spend a card draw to draw it, and that was kind of awkward. So these are now slightly weaker, but mostly the same. The reason I'm not listing these as nerfs is because the way that you get them, the passive, is now works better, which means that even though the cards that are themselves are weaker, the passive being better balances that out. Okay, so permanent buffs. So I've used the term non-temporary several times here, and the reason I've used non-temporary instead of permanent is because permanent buffs mean something different. We have 2 cards here that give you permanent buffs. If you've played a lot of Breach Wanderers, you're probably familiar with permanent buffs on enemies like Emerald Dragon or Chimera or Forest Guardian or Thornberry Chieftain. Permanent buffs are buffs that at the start of turn, if you've lost them, you get them back. So for example, if you play Power Surge, you get permanent powerful 1. If you get hit by an Arcane Detonation, which means that you lose your powerful, then after a turn, that powerful comes back. It's worth noting this only happens if you will only have 1 stack of permanent powerful. If you gain additional powerful that isn't permanent from other sources, and you get Arcane Detonated, you will lose the non-permanent first. You will only get back the permanent powerful if you go below the amount you have. But so this means that Power Surge, so one of the problems you could sometimes have with Power Surge is that if you were going into like Vessel of Knowledge or Arcane Elemental, you would play your Power Surge, and then you'd explode, and you wouldn't have your powerful anymore. And your Power Surge would be an exhaustion, and it would have done, and you would lose all the value from it, and you'd be very sad. That's no longer the case. You will now get to keep your powers full, even after the Power Surge is gone, even if you get detonated, and that's pretty neat. Likewise, Rocky Hide is now permanent plated, and then transforms into Rocky Defense. Same deal. You now get that plated back if you get exploded, or if you lose the plated because it blocked a thing that hit for 0. So both of these cards are now a little bit stronger. It won't come up in that many fights, but in the fights where it does, you'll be very happy about this change. Next thing, discard cards. So here I actually did include the upgraded versions because I think it's relevant for discard because I tend to play discard Inna. So Void Visions. So Void Visions, you draw 1, you discard 1, and you get Wits 2 when a card is discarded. Sorry, when Void Visions is discarded. So this is the same text it had before, except it's now 0 mana instead of 1 mana. So the discard cards, the reason that Void Visions and Rummage got changed is that they are card draw cards that were not buffed when Fatigue was added, and they were a bit too similar. So now they're a bit further apart. So Void Visions is now draw 1, discard 1 for free. Rummage is now 1 mana, discard 1, draw 2. So Void Visions also, though, has value if you discard it. And Void Visions Plus is draw 2, discard 1 now, instead of draw 2, discard 2. So Void Visions Plus is now net neutral on cards. Rummage is also net neutral on cards to begin with, but it doesn't have any value when you discard it. Rummage Plus, you discard 2, and then you draw 4. So you end up at +1 card, because you spent 3 cards, the Rummage, and the 2 cards you discarded. And then you got 4 cards, so you end up a card, and you got 2 discard triggers potentially. So that's pretty neat. Rummage and Void Visions are now both very good. The big thing is Rummage no longer gives you Wits, which makes it worse on its own in the Inna deck because you often will want that Wits to power Brilliant idea, but you will still use it with, so you're more likely to add in Void Visions if you're playing discard Inna. So I'll usually run like 2 and 1 on, I'll either run 2 Void Visions, 1 Rummage, or 2 Rummage, 1 Void Visions. Void Shield. So Void Shield used to be 4 mana gain 10 shield, and you gained, I think it was 4 shield when it was discarded, or something really low like that. Now you get 15 shield, and you get 6 shield when discarded, and when upgraded, it is 22 and 10. So the important note here is 15 shield for 4 mana is actually quite a lot of shield. That is one of the better shield, that makes it one of the best shield cards as far as generic shield cards go, if you just want to pay mana and get shield. So there will be decks where even though you don't have any ways to actually discard Void Shield, you'll still end up wanting to run it just to play as a shield card. Likewise, Void Shield Plus, or especially since Void Shield Plus is now gained 22 shield and 10 shield when discarded, which makes it even more valuable as a card to actually play. 6 and 10 shield are also higher numbers than they were. I think it was like 4 and 7. And so 10 shield on discard or even 6 is enough that you will get value from playing them to discard. And so I think Void Shield is now a card where you are more likely to run it in your discard deck, and you're more likely to play it than you were before, because used to when it was 4 mana for gain 10 shield, it felt really bad anytime you actually had to play it, because it was just worse than block if you were actually playing it, and that is no longer true. So yeah, I like Void Shield a lot now. Growth cards. So pretty much across the board, all of these growth cards are now stronger. Growth was Growth has had sort of an awkward lifespan, because there was a point where it was too good on Rowden. It used to be you got a mana per 5, but then with Rowden it was too strong, so it got nerfed to a mana per 6. And then the problem was that if you weren't playing Rowden, actually stacking Growth was very difficult. So now that's changed. Predict went from 1 mana boost, Growth 1 to 1 mana boost 1, and Growth 2. So this means that if you play Predict 3 times, playing Predict 3 times is enough to bump you up to a growth tier instead of needing to play Predict 6 times. The other note here is that means that if you go, for example, you have 2 Predicts and a Meditate, then that also gets you to 6. And Predict Plus is now finally gained 2 mana up front, which makes it a lot better. So Predict Plus is now you get 2 mana, mana boost 2, and growth 4, which means that you will get quite a bit of progress towards hitting your next mana per turn from growth. And this makes Predict Plus actually a worthwhile consideration for an upgrade. So Predict Plus does still kind of stack awkwardly with other mana boost cards, because of course, if you don't have ways to use up your mana boost, you will run out. You will end up if you end the fight with like 5 mana boost, then that was a bunch of mana that you theoretically could have gotten that didn't do anything for you, because it wasn't ever available to you in terms of what you could actually spend. But despite that, I still think that this makes Predict Plus much more appealing. Predict being growth 2 makes it more appealing as just a one of in very slow decks. And in general, Predict is now, even though this seems like a relatively small change on the surface, I think this makes Predict a lot more appealing of a card overall. Moonlit Reverie. This is another one that got a buff. It used to be, I believe, growth 2, wits 2, frail 1. Now it is growth 3, which means you play Moonlit Reverie twice. That is already a full 6 growth. But more importantly, Moonlit Reverie Plus is now growth 6, wits 3, and frail 1. And what this means is that Moonlit Reverie Plus, once you have that upgrade, every time you play Moonlit Reverie, that is an extra mana per turn for the rest of the fight, at least the first 4 times you do it. So this makes Moonlit Reverie a very, very useful card as a thing you could include in your starting deck to ensure that you have access to growth stacking without needing to commit a bunch of cards. The other thing is, Reverie really benefited from the move from Purity to Cleanse in a lot of decks, because one of the big downsides to Reverie was that every time you played it, it would eat a Purity stack. But if you aren't counting on having Purity, then that downside is basically gone. Mental Growth went from Mana Boost 2 and Growth 3 to Mana Boost 1 and Growth 6. What this means is that it is now functionally a repeatable Cultivate. It does technically cost you 2 mana, but you get that mana back next turn from the Mana Boost. And then you immediately will get +1 mana on the next turn every time you play it, which is previously it would take 2 turns to give you any return unless you had already had enough growth that it put you over the threshold. The other thing is that this means that now if mental growth is your only growth source, it's still a useful card because it isn't reliant on having other cards to help work with it in order to get value. So given that the card does nothing but give growth, it is very important that it does something if it is the only thing that gives growth for you. Because otherwise you would ask, why am I not just playing other cards that would do things besides get growth instead of committing an entire card pick and the mana to just do nothing and not even accomplish the one thing it does. So, sorry, give me a second. So, Mindseed Plus. Mindseed Plus used to be you get growth 3 and 4 mana. Now it is growth 5 and 3 mana. This is kind of interesting because it is not quite enough growth to tip you over to an extra mana per turn, but it is still a lot of growth. In general, I think the Mindseed Plus change is a little bit of a nerf because I think that it was a bit stronger as a way to quickly get 4 mana, but it's certainly not a weak card still. And so Mindseed Plus, if you're trying to build for big growth, Mindseed Plus becomes a great choice for your upgrade because that is just a lot of growth with absolutely no downside. And you don't even have to worry about fatigue, and you don't have to worry about not having the mana to play it. You draw it, you play it, you get a bunch of growth. It's great. Sublime Blast. This used to be like 10 damage to all the enemies, and it was just lower numbers across the board. It is now 16 damage to all enemies. You get growth 4, mana boost 2, and wits 2. So you get a reasonable amount of damage, not an absurd amount, but a reasonable amount. And you get growth and mana boost and wits. This makes it particularly good with Height of Knowledge, which we'll talk about later. So Sublime Blast, very, very, very good. Not very, very, very good. Very much improved. It is much stronger than it was. Sublime Blast will now be more of a fit in the decks that it feels like it was built for, which is decks that are trying to do growth and mana boost type shenanigans. And the fact that it is 8 mana doesn't actually matter that much to those decks because, of course, if you are building a growth deck with mana boost, you probably are planning to play expensive cards. So yeah, I like Sublime Blast a lot more now. I think it is actually, it now fits into the deck that it looks like it should fit into. And that is where I like cards to be. So Frostbite Cards. These got changed in various ways. Let's start with Glacial Stare. Glacial Stare is now, used to be gain 2 mana, trigger Frostbite once on all enemies. Now it's gain 2 mana, you trigger Frostbite twice on one specific enemy of your choice, but if you do, you get 2 additional mana. So this means that Glacial Stare now is now a 4 mana card for the Frostbite deck in the starting deck. It's very important because Frostbite is not a cheap strategy in terms of mana. So being able to start with 2 on-theme mana cards that generate 4 mana is very, very good for the deck. Next, let's talk about, Dead Chill Bolt. So Dead Chill Bolt is a card that is one of several cards this patch that got buffed from doing a largely irrelevant amount of status, just that couple crucial points to 10. So this used to be 3 mana, apply 8 Frost. Now it is 4 mana, apply 10 Frost, which means it is not just worst chill. You will get to freeze something you get to freeze a normal enemy without needing Adept or Vulnerable to work with it. And if you do have Adept or Vulnerable, it will do more for you than it did before. So Dead Chill Bolt is now actually a worthwhile pickup for any deck that's looking to do Frost things, or even some decks that aren't. I think Paladin in particular could possibly pick it up just because of supercharge value. But yeah, Dead Chill Bolt is now actually a reasonable pickup. This is one of the elite cards from the Frost Elementals in Area 1. Flash Freeze. This used to be 2 mana, apply 10 Frost to any enemy. Now it is 3 mana for 12. And then if the enemy is frozen, you give it Frostbite 4. So just slightly more Frost, slightly more Frostbite, very, very slightly higher cost. It does good work. It's basically just a chill replacement in a lot of ways, if your deck has chill, or it's just a way to give a lot of Frostbite out. Either one's fine. It's a pretty just solid, reasonable card. It is a Rowden card, so you only get it on him, but Rowden's happy freezing things. Biting Cold. 3 mana. Deal 15 damage to every enemy with Frostbite. I don't remember what the numbers on it were before, but 15 gets quite a lot of damage to do AoE for only 3 mana, and it upgrades, I believe, to be 25 damage for, I think, only 3 or 4 mana. Biting Cold is now a great way to get some easy damage out with your Frostbite deck. And it will help you deal with larger groups of enemies, which can sometimes be a problem, because the Frostbite deck doesn't have much heavy AoE, except for Biting Cold. But now you have Biting Cold. Elemental Winds. So you trigger Frostbite and burn 2 times on all enemies. If you successfully did either of those, you draw 2 skills. I'm still not a big fan because I'm too lazy to make it work. But this does mean that this is card draw that is somewhat flexible and will do either 10 damage or 6 damage and 6 frost, depending on whether you're a Frostbite deck or a burn deck. You can try and build both, but I haven't been impressed by the deck that is running both. But yeah, it's a solid card. Frostfire Blast. So this one got an incredibly important buff because it used to be deal 6 damage to any enemy, and then you dealt 1 additional damage for every rank of burn and 1 for every rank of frostbite among all enemies. Now it is 2 additional damage per burn and per frostbite to start with, and that goes up to 3 when you upgrade it. This means that the difference between 1 and 2 is obviously double, and it means that Frostfire Blast without an upgrade will actually do an appreciable amount of damage with a reasonable deck. It is now actually a card that the Frostbite deck in particular wants to pick up, and it feels it is still worse than Stoke the Fire in the burn deck, but it is not anywhere near as embarrassing of a comparison as it was before, especially because this does care about burn and frostbite on all enemies instead of just the target, which means that I guess it isn't just worse Stoke, because it does have the advantage of letting you, you can, let's say, stack all of your burn on an elite, and then use the Frostfire Blast to snipe one of the non-elites in the fight without losing all. Whereas Stoke, you'd have to have committed the burn to the thing you were killing, and then that burn is gone after you've killed it. So that's notable. So Frostbite overall this patch got quite a bit stronger, especially because it also got Glacial Touch, which is a new card that is that draws a bunch of cards if you're able to consume a lot of Frostbite off the target. And it also picked up Death Frost Storm, which is a very good AoE Frostbite card that also applies a good amount of Curse. I think I recorded and uploaded a Frostbite run with Rowden, but if not, I need to, because Frostbite is very good this patch. I like it a lot. Anyway, next up, we talked about all the new cards, talked about the nerfs, talked about the changes. Let's talk about just some other random major buffs that don't really have any group connection that I just wanted to talk about. Aether Blast. It used to be vulnerable 1 and apply 5 arcane. Now it is vulnerable 2 to any enemy and apply 4 arcane. This means that you can target it to where you want it to be, and vulnerable 2 is a big upgrade because vulnerable 2 means that you get, so the difference between vulnerable 1 and vulnerable 2 just tends to be pretty big because you get a full extra turn of getting to direct damage at the target before you lose the value. So I think this is quite a bit better. Vicious Retort. You draw 2, you give vulnerable 2 to any enemy. It is free if you evaded an attack last turn. Used to, that was you get Wits 2, and you give vulnerable 2 to any enemy, which is not that valuable because Wits has a very, very, very diminishing returns. Same deal as Mana Boost, where if you have a bunch of Wits at the end of the fight, that is a whole bunch of card draw that you didn't actually get. Now, you do get those cards immediately. And this in particular is valuable because if you have multiple Vicious Retorts, you can draw into they can draw into each other, and the free ignores fatigue. So if you have a lot of Vicious Retorts, you can just keep drawing cards forever. It is one of the few ways to actually go infinite in the game right now. Involves using something like Reforge to get rid of extra cards in your deck, and then getting down to a small enough deck size, and then using Vicious Retort to loop your deck. As long as you have at least 1 mana card there, even if whatever you're actually winning with is going to cost infinite mana, you can eventually, going to cost an absurd amount of mana from fatigue, you can eventually get there. Vicious Retort, very, very good. Absolutely one of the biggest changes in terms of evaluation, because it went from pretty bottom tier, like a card that I almost never took and was never happy to have, and if I ended up with it in like one of my random deck runs, I would cut it very quickly. And even in like decks that could evade, it was very bad. Whereas now it is outstanding, and you're happy to have it. And Merle, it's one of the best Merle cards, best cards to use in Merle decks now. Morley already had fantastic card draw access, and this just makes it even better. And the vulnerable is also useful. Like, the fact that it does give vulnerable is very relevant, especially with new Tinderize. Part of the reason the new Morley Tinderize deck is so good is because of Vicious Retort. So yeah, very good deck, very good card. Other important major buffs. So I mentioned previously that there were a few cards that got buffed to be more relevant numbers. Here are two more of them. Faeric Rime went from 4 mana for 8 Frost and 8 Arcane to 5 mana for 10 Frost and 10 Arcane. This is massive. This means that against a normal enemy, this will be 15 damage without any buffs. This is straight up 15 damage, and they're frozen next turn, the first time you play it. It's 15 damage because if they're frozen, then the Arcane does an extra 5 damage. Faeric Rime also now upgrades to be 6 mana for 15 and 15, which makes it valuable even against bosses, even relatively long into the fight if you're using Adept and Vulnerable. It is just all around a very solid workhorse card. I don't know that I would call it overpowered, but it can certainly do a darn good impression. It is worth noting it is pretty undercosted for what it does. Infuse is 3 mana and does 10 Arcane. Chill is 3 mana and does 10 Frost. Faeric Rime does both of those for 1 mana less than the combined cost, and it's only 1 card instead of 2. Faeric Rime is great. Absolutely run it. It's particularly good in Rowden, but it's great anywhere. Ice Burn. You apply 12 Frost to any enemy, then if it's frozen, give it Burn 2. I want to say this was like 8 Frost before, but it was cheaper. 12 Frost means that you'll actually freeze things with it more often. It is better than Chill, if not by that much. Honestly, Faeric Rime is the better card of the two. Ice Burn is not awful now, and especially if you're playing like Burn Rowden, I could see running Ice Burn. But I, generally speaking, still am not sure quite where I want it. I don't know that it's the best way to apply Frost, and I don't think that freeze decks really care about Burn. Burst of Strength and Gather Power. Gather Power Plus specifically. Regular Gather Power didn't change. So Burst of Strength is lose 3 health, and you gain Powerful 2 this turn. So used to it was just gain Powerful 1 this turn, which was relatively low value. It was hard to get enough out of Powerful 1 this turn to justify spending an entire card on it. But Powerful 2 is not only a bigger buff, lose 3 health is some magic words for a certain lovely lady who does some unhygienic things involving blood. Drophus. I'm talking about Drophus. Burst of Strength is great on Drophus. It is free. It is basically 0 mana. You get a Blood Burst, which is totally cool. You're fine having that. And that Blood Burst does 2 extra damage, and so does everything else you do that turn. It's pretty great. I don't think I would run it on characters that aren't Drophus most of the time, but I would more than happy to have it on Drophus. Gather Power Plus. So Gather Power previously had this problem where the upgrade being 3 Mighty was actually a pretty big downside. It made it hard to get Gather Power Plus going because you would end up needing to upgrade it and your Mighty generation in order for that to be worthwhile. But now, Gather Power Plus, you still only lose 2 Mighty, but you get Powerful 2, which means that it's now a worthwhile upgrade, and it makes the Gather Power deck in general much more reliable. I think Silan is probably the best choice for this because you have Scattered Mod is a very, very good way to generate Mighty at common. Because if you're not playing Silan, you're relying on, I think, Combat Ready and Enrage, which are not amazing ways to stack Mighty. But if you're playing Silan, you can use Scattered Mod and Gather Power, and that's actually a very solid package for scaling for Silan. And then you can upgrade the Gather Power to make it better. Some card draw. Height of Knowledge. So I mentioned Height of Knowledge got better. It is now 1 mana cheaper. That may not sound like much, but it's actually quite significant, especially since Predict and Mental Growth and Sublime Blast all got better, which means that it's going to be a lot easier to get value out of Height of Knowledge. You really want to be able to get Wits and Mana Boost, so having Wits and Mana Boost cards get stronger. Oh, Moonlit Reverie also getting stronger makes this better. And Height of Knowledge Plus draws 9 cards if you meet all the conditions, which means that it literally fills your entire hand. Height of Knowledge is still going to have times when you don't want it, but I think the combination of getting a mana cheaper and having its supporting cards get buffed makes it a lot more appealing in a lot of decks. Pact of Insight. You draw 3, you put 2 Shrivels on top of your deck. So it used to be draw 2, put 2 Shrivels on top of your deck, which was net neutral. You're basically trading cards now for cards next turn. Now you get one extra card beyond what you get one more card than you spent on the shrivels, which means that it is net neutral. Because the third card, of course, the 2 shrivels plus the pact itself are the 3 cards that you're trading for the draw 3. That makes it more appealing. It is also very good, especially on Drophus, who can play through the shrivels. The big downside to the shrivels is, of course, that if you are fatigued, they also will cost more, which means that they will cost you at that point mana and health and shield, and that can make it pretty bad in multiples in particular. Pact of Insight Plus is now draw 5, put 3 shrivels on top of your deck, which is very close to Depraved Designs, which is a card that I like a lot. So yeah, Pact of Insight, quite a bit better. Still best on Drophus, but now a potential consideration on other characters too, I think. Mystic Ritual. Straight up draws 6 instead of 4. The upgrade is now draw 8 and apply 10 Arcane to yourself. You may recognize draw 8 as the same number that Ruinous Gamble does. So Mystic Ritual Plus is a Ruinous Gamble that trades the risk of 50 damage for the guarantee without certain items of taking 10 damage. But 10 damage is not that big. You can block 10, and drawing 8 cards is a heck of a reward. And even if you aren't upgrading it, drawing 6 is worth taking 10 a lot of the time. Yeah, sometimes you lose buffs to it, but those cards. I love Mystic Ritual. It's very good. It was okay before. It was good before Fatigue, because all the other card draw was worse. And then it was okay at 5 mana draw 4. And now at 5 mana draw 6, it is great again. I love it. And Mystic Ritual Plus is absolutely an amazing card that has no risks. I don't know what you're talking about. Other buffs. Restorative Shield. This was 3 mana. You got 6 shield and like 4 healing. Now it is 6 shield and heal 2 per card in your hand. This means, especially on Drophus, who is very good at filling her hand, this will often be gain 6 shield and then heal like 12, which is a bargain for 4. This is a mend. This is better than mend. And the upgrade is heal 3 per card in your hand, which means that it is very easy for this to heal you all the way back up to your max recoverable. It's great. I love it. It has replaced mend in my Drophus decks as my secondary healing card. Besides, I'll do 1x Sanguine Melody and 1x Restorative Shield. It's very good. The theme of this slide, if you couldn't tell, is Drophus. Restorative Shield is a generic card. You can run it on other characters, but Drophus gets the most out of it because Drophus is the one who cares most about this big heal. Tainted Blood. So it used to be you got Poison Blood 2 and you applied like 3 poison to the first 2 enemies. Now you get Poison Blood 2 and you lose 3 health, which means that you will immediately apply Poison 1 to all enemies, which isn't much, but you also will get a Blood Burst. And getting a Blood Burst makes everything better. And the upgrade makes you lose 3x2 health, so you get 2 Blood Bursts. This makes it way more appealing in the Poison Drophus deck, which already has other self-damage in the form of like Poison Missile, and it's still a Drophus deck, so you still have other stuff. I think New Tainted Blood is pretty cool. It's still not an amazing card, but it is definitely a card that you will run and get value out of when you run it, even if it isn't the bestest thing ever. It is particularly good at shredding Purity on monsters where that's relevant. There's just not many of them. Vampiric Needle. You know, it used to be just deal 5 damage to any enemy and lifesteal. Now it's lose 3 health, deal 8 damage to any enemy and lifesteal. So the same net healing if there are no buffs or debuffs involved, but the fact that it now loses health means that it comes with a Blood Burst, which is a big improvement, because that means that just between that and the damage that buff that it just outright gets, that means that it went from 2 mana deal 5 to a potential 4 mana deal 18. And that is quite a bit stronger in terms of how much impact you're getting. And split into 2 hits, and the 8 damage being a higher number up front means that if you have Mighty or the enemy is vulnerable, you get bigger bonuses and thus more life out of it. Just overall, Vampiric Needle is now a stronger card. It is funny to me, it's basically traded with where Vampiric Strike used to be. Vampiric Strike used to be you lose health and you deal damage and it had lifesteal, and now it is extra damage to bleeding things. But regardless, Vampiric Needle is still good. Katon cards. Bouncing Bolt. So Bouncing Bolt used to be very good, and then we broke it and then it got nerfed, and then we broke it again, and it got nerfed again, and then Catan launched with an unplayable Bouncing Bolt. Sorry. But now Bouncing Bolt's good again. So Bouncing Bolt, 1 mana, you deal 6 damage to any enemy, and then you create a temporary copy of Bouncing Bolt that costs 1 more. So the Bouncing Bolt, the first one, so if you're in, sorry, you create the temporary copy if you're in spell stance when you play the bolt. So you play a strike, now you play Bouncing Bolt. The first one's free because you're in spell stance, so it costs 1 less. Then the next one will cost you 1 mana if you're in spell stance, and then 2 mana, and so on. Bouncing Bolt is a card that you're absolutely going to upgrade, though, because the upgrade is 0 mana up front, and it deals 10 damage, which means that the first 2 are free. Because you do your strike, you play it, you're now in spell stance. Bouncing Bolt Plus costs 0 mana, but so it costs technically -1, although that -1 isn't shown and doesn't have a mechanical benefit until the copy shows up, which is going to cost 1 base. You play a strike, you go to spell stance. Bouncing Bolt Plus, the second one, is now still free. It's another 10 damage, and you can do it again. And the next one costs 1 mana, and so on. The downside is you do need a lot of strikes to power this, and strikes tend to be relatively hard to get in the numbers you need to pay off Bouncing Bolt, especially if you're also running like Overflow, so your Quick Blast are eating up your spell, also really want to eat your spell stance. But overall, Bouncing Bolt is now quite a bit stronger and a lot easier to get value out of than it was before. Purging Strike. It used to be cleanse yourself 1 time if you're in spell stance. Now it's cleanse yourself twice if you're in spell stance. Purging Strike is still only good if you're playing Catan in a way that cares about having debuffs on you, which means Catan that cares about ending the turn. And that's not how I play Catan. But if you're playing a more reasonable Catan deck that isn't trying to do absurd nonsense on turn 1, Purging Strike is now better. But why would you do that? A couple other character cards. Resourceful Strike. It is now 8 damage to the first enemy, 4 additional damage to it per tool in hand for 4 mana. I believe the upgrade is 6 additional damage per tool in hand. This means that it actually scales up reasonably quickly. It used to be only like 2 or 3 additional damage per tool in hand, which meant that even with a full hand of tools, it wasn't that much damage. It was only 2 mana instead of 4, but the fact that it had such a relatively low top end meant that it was unexciting. Now you can actually play a more aggressive in a deck that uses Resourceful Strike to do a lot of damage. If you play this with even 4 or 5 tools in it, if you play this with 5 tools in hand, then it's 28 damage for 4 mana, which isn't bad. And because that is 28 base damage, that will of course be increased by Mighty. And if you have more tools, if you're like 6 tools, if you're at 7 tools, now you're doing really, really significant damage. 1 with Shadows Plus. Gain Hidden. This turn, you don't lose Hidden when attacking, create 2 temporary backstabs. This looks like a nerf on the surface of it, because it says 1 mana instead of 0. However, it now creates upgraded backstabs. That's huge, because upgraded backstabs do twice as much damage. So now you upgrade 1 with Shadows, and then you play Backstab Plus, and it does 20 damage if you get a critical hit with it instead of 10 it does 40 damage on a crit because it's 10 base plus 10 for being hidden plus 2x for getting a critical hit with Merly. So this goes from being a card that's potentially 4 mana for 40 damage to 5 mana for 80 damage, which that's a pretty big number. 80 is that's more than a singularity, my friends. That's no joke. And it's split into 2 hits of 40, so it can chew through 2 enemies potentially. Yeah, 1 with Shadows Plus is now incredibly good. It was already incredible. 1 with Shadows was previously incredibly good. 1 with Shadows Plus was often not that good of an upgrade because it was just -2 cost. 1 with Shadows Plus is now an incredibly good upgrade. You want to take this one, folks. I think that's... Yeah, no, I'm done. Yeah, I've talked for only a little over an hour. Actually pretty good. But yeah, I'm done. That's all the changes I'm actually going to talk about. There are a lot more cards that changed, but most of them, my notes on them are basically, this card is slightly better. You'll run it slightly more than you did. Or this card is slightly worse. You'll run it slightly less than you did. These cards are changed in ways that I think makes them... There's actually only 2 on a line here. This is Shocking Aura and Improvised Strike are 2 separate cards. I I don't edit my videos. That's something that a professional would do. And the idea of actually having to put in effort scares me. So here are all the notable changes that I'm skipping just because I don't really want to bother putting together even more slides. Arcane Nova, Drain Life, Frost Fracture, Increasing Assault, Magic Cannon, Mana Lance, Mana Ritual, Mana Shield, Mind Shield, Nimble Strike, Quip Shot, Riposte, Scattered Beam, Scramble, Shocking Aura, Improvised Strike, Preparations, Ice Blast, Shattering Strike, Arcane Flow, Draw Toxin, Frantic Onslaught, Horrifying Mutation, Impaling Rose, Oblivion Blast. All of these were changed in ways that I think actually meaningfully impact the scenarios in which you will play them to at least a minor extent. I'm just too lazy to talk through them. And then here are the changes that I wouldn't talk about even if I had the time, because I don't think they affect at all. Either they are changes that are just like wording changes, or very, very minor functional changes, or they move the numbers around in a way that I don't think has a meaningful impact on the use cases where you would run it. So that's Absorb Element, Adventurer's Log, Blizzard, Blood Visions, Channeled Blast, Charge Text, Chilling Jolt, Corrupted Blast, Curse of Decrepitude, Delayed Burst, Draining Strike, Emergency Shield, Hex, Icy Punch, Mental Respite, Mind Probe, Piercing Strike, Potent Augury, Renewing Ray, Shadow Veil Strike, Shatter, Shocking Blast, Slash, Sludge Salvo, Sundering Blast, Thorn Whip, Treasure Map, Unleash the Storm, Voltaic Assault, Voltaic Frost, Voodoo Blast, and Zap. Yeah, some cards changed, okay? So last note, like I said, patch notes link is in the YouTube description. If you are curious about any of the original cards, or if you're curious about any of that long list of cards in the last two slides that I just kind of breezed past, see the patch notes. They will tell you exactly what changed and what the old version was. And if you are curious about my thoughts on one of those, or you think that I skipped over something that you really wanted to hear my thoughts about, absolutely leave a comment and I will get back to you. I am, as you can probably tell, always more than happy to spend a lot of words explaining my thoughts on this card game, because I'm a real adult with real adult priorities. But my throat is tired. I've been talking for an hour. You've been watching for an hour. Hopefully less. Hopefully you're watching it at multiple speeds. I guess like and subscribe. Those are YouTube words. See you next time. Toodles.